Oh, God bless you. Thank you. So they couldn't make my old laptop. Everybody that works around me, they're like, would you please take that thing outside and run over it with your car and get a Mac? Yeah. He told me, hey, look, it actually does work. They gave me that. So I'm not used to using that, but that should work, hopefully. Hey, are you having a great time already? Well, hopefully you are, and hopefully you were able to have dinner just now, right? To get all of the protein that you're going to need to endure my extended 6.5-hour presentation that begins now. Yeah, you say that, but look, I know as well as anybody that a little bit of Tom Horn goes a long way, right? So I am just joking. Don't run for the exit doors. You know, the other guy that he thought he was getting ready to introduce a minute ago, I think is Timothy Alberino, is going to be speaking after me, right? What? Did I get it wrong? Who's speaking after me? Randall Price? Well, that's worse. Actually, it's kind of equal. It's just that Timothy Alberino is younger and handsomer, right, ladies? Randall Price, he's like one of the titans. Give me a break. This kind of reminds me of having to open some years ago for Dr. Willard Cantillon. Remember him? The brainiac. And before he passed away in 1999, he spoke at the Brooks Old-Fashioned Camp meeting, where I had authority over the campgrounds at that time and some other stuff too for the AG. He spoke on the subject of Darwinian evolution versus creationism. And I will never forget his opening statement that day when he walked to the platform and he looked us all in the eyes and he said this. He said, man is not a transcendental ideation of intraseptic autocatholic solidaric redaction, nor an orgasmic individuality of mobilized egresses, nor an atypical vodality of Voltronized, transfusiformed differentiation spontaneously race-mated into homogeneous individuality, for crying out loud. Now, Dr. Cantillon went on to explain to us that the only thing that he had said that day is that man is not a process of Darwinian evolution, and that he had decided to start his presentation with that polysyllabic meandering to simply make the case that the Darwinians so often couch their presentations in the most complex kind of language in order to give it the false impression of being more scientifically or historically or genetically supported than what in fact it actually is. Well, it was a little easier for me to follow the logic of the little girl who was attending public school, and as you know, in our public schools across America, we teach Darwinian evolution as if it was a fact, right? And the little girl's going to school and she's hearing all this stuff, and one day she comes home and she says, Daddy, she says, can you tell me where you think people came from? And the father said, well, sure, honey, a long time ago, God made a man and a woman, and they got married, and they started having babies, and that's where people came from. Well, the little girl thought about that during the day, and later on in the day, she ran into her mother. And she said, Mom, can you tell me where you think people came from? And the mother said, yes, a long time ago, there was monkeys, there were apes, and we evolved from the monkeys. Well, this really confused the little girl, who then went back to her daddy and she said, Daddy, you told me that a long time ago God made a man and a woman, and that's where people came from. But Mommy says there were monkeys, and we evolved from the monkeys. And the father looked at his little girl and he said, well, honey, it's really very simple. I was telling you about my side of the family, and she was telling you about hers. Don't you love kids? Well, it actually has a little something to do with the last two investigations that I've had the opportunity to be part of. I actually have no idea how I'm going to get through this in 56 remaining minutes, but we'll do the best we can. If I talk a little bit fast, you'll just have to make your ears hear me fast. But it has to do with unearthing the lost world of the cloud eaters, my project with the one and only Steve Quayle, right? And that was 2016, the early part of this year. And then finally, we got on the newest project, Saboteur Shadow Government in Quest of a Final World Order, which just absolutely came out this month. But both of these, amazingly, are somehow tied to the subject matter of the contest between Darwinian evolution and the biblical narrative. Does it work? It works! Don't you love technology when it works? Have you used technology when it won't work? I know you did. You're kicking your computer outside the window. I know. But I'm going to do this. In order to explain to you how I got where I am, unearthing the lost world of the cloud eaters as well as saboteurs, I need to go back a few years ago to 2009. Now, I was speaking at our dear brother Chuck Misler's Strategic Perspectives Conference in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. And I was one of the keynote speakers, but it wasn't yet my turn to speak. In fact, I think Joel Richardson was up speaking, another one of our dear friends. I was standing in the back by the book tables with my son, Joe Artis, the wild man of the Ozarks, the guitar assassin. If you don't know who he is, blow your mind sometime watching him and that other doodad that was up here a minute ago tearing up the guitar. He's a friend of mine. I'm picking on him. What was I talking about? Oh, we were back at the book table, and I often say, I'm sorry, this is as good as it gets. And I'm not joking. This is as good as it gets. So you just have to hang on, and I'll say a lot of words, and then it's your responsibility to put it together and make sense out of it. We were standing back at the book table, and we got to talking about something. We got to talking about how unusual it was, 2009, that the famous Catholic prophecy of the popes was about to come to its conclusion. And no matter what you make of it, whether you believed in it, you don't believe in it, you think it's a bunch of hooey, or you put a lot of stock into it, as a lot of popes and other Catholics and some non-Catholics had, for historical reasons only, it was important because it's 900 years old and it was about to come to an end. So I'm talking with my son and I'm saying it's amazing to me that nobody has done a thorough examination of the prophecy of the popes to completely evaluate where did it come from? Is it real? Is it not real? Is it divinely inspired, demonically inspired? Is it a complete hoax? And for historicity purposes, as I'm talking to my son, he's like, well, Dad, you're the CEO of a publishing house. Maybe you should write the book, or maybe you should assign that project to somebody. And to make a long story short, we made a bunch of notes, and I said, okay, before it's my responsibility to get up and speak, I'm going to go upstairs and email these questions to myself so that when I get off of this trip, I won't forget that I want to follow up with the subject matter. So I go up to my room, 2009, right? And I'm sitting in there and I'm emailing myself some questions about the prophecy of the popes, and I hear my inbox ping right as I'm typing. And I look down and I have an email from a guy that I've never met before. I only knew vaguely that he had like a blog where he talked about apologetics or something. The man Chris Putnam, right? Yeah. For those of you who don't know, you probably all do, but I'll say this in case there's some that don't. Chris Putnam passed away just a few months ago, 51 years of age, died in the middle of the night of heart failure. But it was that day, 2009, he emailed me, and of all things, I open up his email. And again, we've never met, we don't know each other, and he wants to know if he can use the only paragraph that I had ever written, and this many years earlier, on the subject of the prophecy of the popes. And I said, Chris, You can't believe the timing of your email, brother. We were just talking about this. Well, long story short, I got to skip all the details. That was the first of what we believe to be numerous preternatural events, supernatural events, God moments, right? Have you ever had one of those where you just can't put your finger on it, but it is God's timing? And we decided that we were going to write the book. We were going to work together to write the book. Ultimately became an international bestseller. There's the cover of it up there. Petrus Romanus, the final pope, is here. Now, for those of you who do not know what I mean by the prophecy of the popes, in very short summary, in the 1100s, there was an Irish bishop by the name of Malachy Morgair. He was a priest of the people. He loved the people. They loved him. He was ascribed with having the gift of healing and the gift of prophecy. But suddenly he was summoned by the then Pope, Pope Celestine II, to travel to Rome to give an update on his diocese at the Vatican. And as all priests in that day would have been wont to do, he had never seen the Vatican City. He wanted to see it. So as quickly as possible, he puts together his entourage, his beasts of burdens. They get their supplies together. And he begins what will become an arduous 9-month journey across Europe. During that time, traveling from Ireland to Rome, he sees the conditions of the people, the terrible circumstances, the Black Death, the wantonness, the suffering, the pain. And all of this is weighing very heavily on Malachy's mind when 9 months later, he arrives at the Seven Hills City. Now, you have to understand, during this time in history, historians and theologians refer to this as the pornocracy. And they call it that because, in stark contrast to the average person, in the Vatican City they were living in opulence, regalia, wine, political power, ecclesiastical authority, privilege and splendor and parties and all of this stuff. And this is weighing heavily, more so than even the trip on Malachy's mind. It's off-putting to him. And so he goes in. A couple days later, he has his meeting with Pope Celestine. He's kind of repulsed by everything that he is seeing there. And then he quickly makes arrangements to leave the Vatican, to get out of town as fast as he can back to his people in Ireland. But this is where something strange begins to unfold. For according to the historical accounts, it is as Malachy is coming up out of the Seven Hills City, all of a sudden something happens to him. Some say the Spirit of God fell upon him. Others say it was a demonic spirit and it was meant for end times deception. Others say it's a total hoax and it never really even happened, although we do know at a minimum that the prophecy of the popes is at least 500 plus years old, as it was brought out of the Vatican archives then and published in Arnold de Wyon's massive 1,700-page book, Lignum Vitae. And from that time and forward, oddly enough, has actually become more accurate even than it was before that. But in any case, Malachy is on the top of this hill. Something comes on him and he utters a single line in Latin that can only be understood as a kind of judgment against the papacy. Even though he's a Catholic priest, the essence of this line is that God is only going to let this kind of corruptible religious system go on so long. And then he takes out a pen and he begins writing down, a quill, he begins writing down a series of 112 lines. Each one of these lines represented each pope that would arrive in succession from his day until the final one. So from Celestine II to the 112th pope on his list, who he calls, in symbolic language, Petrus Romanus, or Peter the Roman. All popes are known as Peter, but this would be Peter the Roman. And it would be during the reign of Peter the Roman that he says the earth, the church, the world, will enter into the Great Tribulation period, followed by the destruction of Rome and the arrival of who he called the great and terrible judge, Jesus Christ himself, who would judge the quick and the dead and separate the sheep from the goats. And we know that that prophecy is based partly on the New Testament predictions of the second coming of Christ. Chris and I knew in 2009 that we were then at the next to the last pope. We were at Pope number 111, Pope Benedict XVI, who was called in the prophecy the glory of the olives, and indeed he was among the Olivetan order and a fulfillment of his line in the prophecy. Now, here though is what made our book, that book right there, an international bestseller. The further we researched into this prophecy, whether it's, and we, by the way, if you've ever read the book, we're very even-handed. We don't argue in favor of it or against it or anything else. We just try to be very careful, put all of the details out there. But Chris and I came to believe something. This was partly based on information of the deepest order being fed to us during the Vatican leaks from the Vatican itself. These are names we've never gave up, never will give up. I'm not sure how much torture I could take, so maybe we would give it up. But we became convinced that Benedict XVI was going to break order, was not going to follow what for hundreds of years popes before him had done, and that is die in office, but rather he was going to step down. And you can go to YouTube and you can see programs with me and Gary Stearman. I don't know if Gary's here tonight, but we did programs 2011. We were on with Sid Roth, Sid Supernatural. We're on the Jim Baker Show. We're on Late Night with George Norrie, Coast to Coast AM. And in 2011, Chris Putnam and I began making a very bold prediction in that we said we believe that Pope Benedict is going to resign office, citing health reasons. And by the way, we took a lot of flack from a lot of Catholics who said, you evangelicals are stupid. You don't have any idea what you're talking about. Popes don't resign from office. They die in office and then they're replaced. But we said he's going to resign. And then before the end of 2011, we took it to a new place. We said not only that, but we believe that Pope Benedict XVI is going to step down in April of 2012. Very specific, right? And neither of us claimed to be prophets. This was simply based on our analysis and some information that was being fed to us from deep sources inside the Vatican. Now, when 2012 came and went, and it did not appear that Benedict had resigned, we thought, okay, you know, we missed the date, but we still believe in the value of our work. We still think it's important. But the world today knows what happened next. February 28th, 2013, what happens? The Vatican announces that Pope Benedict XVI has resigned from office. And that same day, they give an interview, the Vatican's media outlet, the El Observatorio Romano, they give an interview with a journalist from the New York Times. You can Google this back to 2013 and read it, in which they admitted that Pope Benedict actually, officially, secretly resigned following a meeting at the end, following a trip that he had taken at the end of March 2012, and internally made it official before the Roman Curia in April of 2012. When that happened, our phones were ringing off the hook. Everybody everywhere wanted to know how in the world we could have possibly made such an unprecedented prediction and have it come true to the year and the date. And I always told them, they said they wanted to know who our insider was. I said, if I told them the insider was the Holy Spirit, that'd really confuse them, right? But we made that prediction and it came to pass. And suddenly now we are in media everywhere. CNN contacted me 3 times. They practically begged me to go on CNN, but I told them I don't do fake news. The History Channel asked us to do a program with them. I said no. Chris said yes. You can still go back and watch that 12-week, whatever it was. They mixed up Nostradamus with the prophecy of the popes and a bunch of stuff, but they treated Chris fair on that program. World Net Daily produced the documentary film, The Last Pope. I mean, we're just in media everywhere, right? But a very, very strange thing began happening. And some of you might even recall this. So now here we are, we're out there, we're on television and radio, but whenever people had the opportunity, like on Coast to Coast AM, to call in to ask questions, something strange started happening in that more often than not, they weren't asking us about the Pope. What they wanted to know is, what do you make of the Vatican being out there now talking so much about aliens? Do you remember that? All of a sudden, the aliens are our brothers, and we would baptize the aliens into the Catholic faith. And this reminded Chris and I of something that another Jesuit priest had predicted. Father Malachi Martin, remember him? The insider of insiders, a formidable polyglot. Malachi Martin could speak 17 languages. He worked under 3 popes for many years. He was actually the personal secretary for the most famous Jesuit in history, Augustine B. He had access to the secrets of Fatima and other deeply held secrets at the Vatican. In fact, he worked inside the Holy See. Malachi Martin is the one who translated the Dead Sea Scrolls for the Vatican. So this guy was a brain. And at one point, though, he asked the Pope if he could have leave of his priestly duties, which he got. Some of you know that he moved to New York City, right? And he became a multi-time New York Times best-selling author of books that he called Faction, fiction based on fact, in which he began giving up some of the deepest secrets of the Vatican. Well, it was during that time in 1997 when Art Bell invited Father Martin to come on the late night talk show Coast to Coast AM, and it was on that program when he asked Father Martin, he said, Father, why is the Vatican so heavily invested in the study of deep space? And why did they force themselves onto the top of a mountain in southeastern Arizona? And I'll explain, if I get a chance, why Art Bell said they forced themselves onto the top of that mountain. But in southeastern Arizona, the top of Mount Graham, where they built the great observatory up there with the 3 telescopes, and hopefully I'll have time to talk about that too. But it was Malachi Martin's answer that ignited a kind of firestorm that night. Because this is what he said, and you can go to YouTube and look this up and hear Father Martin saying this himself in 1997. He said the reason that they are up on the top of Mount Graham is because at the highest level of Vatican governance and jurisprudence, they know what is approaching the earth, and that it is going to be of the utmost importance in coming years. Now, when Malachi said that, you know, people were, they didn't have a blogosphere, but whatever osphere they had back then, it was going crazy, right? People everywhere wanted to know, what in the world is he talking about? Is he referring to this ancient Catholic prophecy about the approach of an asteroid at the end of times? Is he talking about a mothership, you know, with a whole bunch of UFO armada headed towards Earth? Is he talking about Nibiru, the 9th planet, Planet X? What in the world is he talking about? Well, Malachi Martin later was pressed for more information, and he said something very interesting. He said that it was his belief that what the Vatican was monitoring in deep space on top of Mount Graham would begin becoming very important, he thought, in about 10 years' time, and after which he thought we would move into a slow disclosure. But he never fully explained what he was talking about. Interestingly, though, 10 years later, almost to the day, what does the Vatican do? They called for an astrobiology study week in which they invited the Pontifical Academy, the scientists for the Vatican, together with brainiacs like, Josh Peck is here and he's talking about into the multiverse, right? I have a hard time getting into the refrigerator, let alone the multiverse, but those kind of guys, quantum physicists, guys that study M-brain theory and string theory and parallel realities and all of that. But they also invited theologians and even exorcists to convene on the grounds of the Pope's summer residence in Gandolfo, Italy, in 2007, to ask one specific question. Now, I also, by the way, invited people from NASA, SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, but to study one question, this: what will the impact on faith be? What will the impact on religion be given the disclosure or the discovery of advanced extraterrestrial intelligence? 90 days later, the Royal Society meets, the oldest scientific body in the world, come together to celebrate their 350th year anniversary. And for that historic moment, what did they do? They invited the same astronomers from the Vatican, the same quantum physicists, the same people from SETI to go to the UK to study a week long and to ask essentially the same question among other things: what is the impact on faith and religion going to be given the disclosure or the discovery of advanced extraterrestrial intelligence? Now, with that in mind, media began asking the Vatican to please give them spokespersons that could explain why now all of a sudden is everybody talking about this. I mean, have you found something? Lord Martin Rees, who was at that time the Queen's royal astronomer, said that there are aliens looking at us directly in the face that we can't even recognize. What were these guys talking about, and why would they say such things, right? So the Vatican sends out two of their key astronomers. Father Jose Gabriel Funes, who was at that time the head of the Vatican Observatory Research Group. If you read the book Petrus Romanus, because the acronym is VORG, boy, did Chris Putnam have a lot of fun comparing them to the Borg, right? The VORG, the Vatican Observatory Research Group. And then they sent out another astronomer, Brother Guy Consolmagno, who at that time was the Pope's personal astronomer, the keeper of asteroids and other things that have fallen from the heavens, bin stones or something that the Vatican has in possession, but he was the official keeper of these extraterrestrial objects. They send these two men out, and something very interesting began happening. I don't know if I got time, but I think I got to talk about this. Jose Gabriel Funes, he begins doing something, and I picked up on it about 3 to 4 months into his dialogue with the press. It's called the Fabian process of gradualism. It's the other Hegelian dialectic that you don't hear very many people talk about, but in simple terms, all it really means is if you want to take either a person or a people group from a particular worldview and change their worldview, you can't just rush in like coming to a bunch of Christians and saying, I believe that Santa Claus is God. I mean, their worldview is going to reject it immediately, right? They're just going to say you're a nut job. But what you do is instead you start introducing small hypothetical or theoretical ideas, and you just add the big what ifs. What if this were true or that were true? And then what would you, and then over a long period of time you keep ratcheting up. Oh, even a better illustration is Karl Marx. Marx said you are never going to violently overthrow the land of the free and the home of the brave. If you want to change America to socialist or Marxist, what do? You invade their halls of higher education. And slowly but surely, you continue to ratchet up through the Fabian process of gradualism, and eventually someday they will become socialist or Marxist. Well, guess what? Over 50% of Americans now today, polls say they prefer socialism over free market capitalism. So this Fabian process works. Well, what does that have to do with Jose Funes? Well, I noticed when he first came out and the media is saying, okay, what are you guys doing? Why is the Vatican talking so much about this right now? He said, well, it's just, it's an exercise in theory. I mean, we're just speculating. We're out there now. We're finding so many planets, right? Exo-worlds, the TRAPPIST star system, all of the so-called Goldilocks zones. We're literally into the thousands of planets now that they believe might have the conditions, right, that to be hospitable for life as we know it. And so Funes says, we're just kind of getting ahead of the story. And plus, he admitted the Catholic Church has kind of a bad background in all this. They persecuted scientists in the past, and we repent, we're sorry, we want to be friends with the scientists, and so we're just kind of getting ahead of the story. Well, that was fine, but then the Fabian process. He comes back a few months later, and he says, and another thing, not only is it not heresy to believe in extraterrestrial intelligence, but rather, he said, the heresy would be not to believe in extraterrestrials, because that would be to place limitations upon God's creative ability. He allowed that to sit out there for a while, and a few months later he came back and he said, and one more thing. One thing we know about ourselves is that we are fallen. But this is not something that we can necessarily assume about our extraterrestrial brethren. And if they are not fallen, then therefore they would be morally superior to us. And therefore they might know more about God and the Godhead and the gospel even than what we do. And therefore it might not be us baptizing them into our faith, but rather they might be coming here to baptize us into a corrected version of the gospel as we have known it. And on the heels of that, Opus Dei level theologians for the Vatican, including Father Tanzella Nitti. Tanzella Nitti teaches at the Pope's University in Rome, and he has written a paper that is right now going through the slow process. This can take years, it can take a decade in the Vatican, but a slow process of evaluation until eventually it can become either a doctrinal statement or whatever. And he wrote a paper, and by the way, if you purchase anything off of the Skywatcher Defender tables out there, tell them to give you the free data DVD. It's literally got tens of thousands of pages of information on it. It's got movies. It's got entire ancient libraries that you can't even get anymore, but it's got something else. It's got Father Tanzella Nitti's paper in it, right? And in this paper, he says this. He says, soon we could come into contact with information of a religious nature from an extraterrestrial source that might require us to change everything we have ever thought we knew about God and the gospel. Sounds like a pretty good setup for great deception, actually, doesn't it? So with all of that in mind, I reached out to Brother Guy Consolmagno, who today is the Vatican Observatory Research Group leader. He has been on an international tour, actually, for the last 24 months, going to colleges and universities, and the name of his lecture is, Would You Baptize an Alien? So they're keeping this discussion going. But I reached out to him, and he agreed to be interviewed by me, and it turned out to be 5 different times from the Vatican via the internet. But why did I in particular want to talk to him? He was one of the 2 major talking heads, but there was another reason I wanted to talk to Consolmagno, and that was because a year or 2 earlier, they had began advertising that Consolmagno, the Pope's personal astronomer, was going to publish a book called Intelligent Life in the Universe. And they were promising to give up some major Catholic secrets in this book. I was one of the first guys. I went to the Catholic Truth Society, the publishing house that's owned by the Vatican that was going to publish his book. I signed up to get my first copy. In fact, I went on the radio with Steve Quayle. We did 2 or 3 shows talking about this book is coming out. I can't wait to get it because I want to know, where are these guys really coming from, right? Well, the date for the release came, and I waited, and I waited, and I waited, and I waited, and I never received it. And finally, I got a hold of the Catholic Truth Society and found out that almost the day that this book was released to the market, it was pulled from the market. And it almost seemed to be a concerted effort to go out and get every copy and take it out of the marketplace, right? Well, Tom Horn, now my head has gone off the Richter scale in terms of the conspiracy here, right? And so, while I was talking to Brother Consolmagno, I asked him about it. I said, hey, I really wanted a copy of your book, and it was immediately pulled. Do you know anywhere where I can get a copy of your book? Well, he very graciously emailed me his own personal typeset copy of the book Intelligent Life in the Universe, and it too is on that data DVD back there you can have for free. So get it, read it. It's a short book. It's only like 70 or 80 pages long. But why do I recommend it? Because this was when I finally started getting to the bottom of a few things. In that I ask him about it, he sends me the book, and I start reading the book while I'm interviewing him. And I read in the book where he says that it is not beyond comprehension to imagine that Jesus Christ himself is the offspring of one of these alien races. Now, I emailed him back and I said, Brother Consomagno, do you got some explaining to do? I said that what you are describing is what people in the ancient astronaut and the alien abduction community, they would call this alien abduction. In other words, you're saying that the Immaculate Conception is just a really old Catholic term for alien abduction, that aliens came down and took Mary, and she was a virgin, and they artificially impregnated her, and Jesus was born as a star child of some other race. Now, by the way, if you think I'm making that up, get the booklet and read it, because that's exactly what he says in his own book. But it gets even hairier from there. He then goes on in his book and in the conversations that I had with him. In fact, I asked him, I said, Brother Consomagno, all these guys out there now for the church, and they're talking about the aliens could be morally superior to us, and they're going to come here and correct our understanding of the gospel. I said, this is some pretty scary stuff for just an old fat preacher like me. I mean, where are you guys coming from with this? And he says to me, he says, well, Tom, haven't you read where Jesus said, I have other people that you know not of? And furthermore, he said, haven't you ever read the book of Genesis, chapter 6? He said, there it is. Advanced aliens came from another world and taught people things. They were smarter than they were. They were technologically superior. And I'm just literally looking at him like, are you kidding me? Yeah, they came. We call them the fallen watchers. And yes, they did teach mankind things they didn't know. Superior weapon making so that they could so more easily destroy one another. They taught them how to take roots and mix them with magical potions to practice pharmakia, to put themselves into contact with other dimensional entities, which was forbade by God after the fact. And yeah, they were a lot bigger. They were physically stronger. But these would be the last, whatever they are, in heaven or on earth, right? That I would want to come and baptize me into a corrected understanding of the gospel. This is some freaky stuff. Okay, look, I got 25 minutes. So here's what we had to do. Chris and I knew that if we were going to get to the bottom line behind all this, we were going to have to go to the horse's mouth. Or should I say, we were going to have to go to the Catholic horse's mouth. You know there's Catholic horses, don't you? That's right. In fact, this week, they're doing this right now in a lot of the Catholic churches. This week, they're blessing the animals. They bring in the animals, including horses, and they bless them and sanctify them to the church. So they're Catholic horses. But I don't want a conspiracy to get started here, because many of you know, in fact, some of you support Whispering Ponies Ranch. And you know that Nita and I have a lot of horses we use in therapy, and I want you to know that we have had all of the horses at WPR certified evangelical. Not a single one's ever been seen with a rosary around their hoof. So we're good. We knew if we were going to get to the bottom line, Chris and I were going to have to go to the horse's mouth, which means, really, we were going to have to go to the top of Mount Graham. And we were going to have to meet with the Jesuit astronomers face to face. And we were going to, if possible, going to put them on film, by the way, all of which happened. In fact, it was the book after this, Exo Vaticana, tells the entire story. And Exo Vaticana was a bigger seller even than Petrus Romanus because of our exploits. People say that when they read that book, they love the opening chapter in there where I'm describing the whole trip up to the top of the mountain. People say, man, they cue the Indiana Jones music, right? Dun, 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 dun. It was kind of that, except that Joe and Chris both got sick to their stomach. I was smart enough to take Dramamine or whatever they call it, and the switchback roads, and oh my gosh. But the bottom line is, you don't just jump in your car and drive to the top of Mount Graham and jump out and say, we're here to see the aliens, right? It takes something to get up there. And so I negotiated this, long story short, through the Arizona State University. And on a particular day, I met Chris Putnam at the base of Mount Graham together with Joe Artis, who went as our cameraman. And we went up. They took us past the locked gates with all the different signs on the gates talking about all the terrible things they were going to do to us if we dared get off the trails once you get up there. And it's true, they have a police presence up there. Even the walkways are marked out. You step across the line. They told me, I didn't try it. They said, you step across the line, you're arrested. They're taking you straight to jail. So they're very protective of everything up there. And because I only have 22 minutes, I'm going to do this very quickly. We go to the top of the mountain. First thing we do is we go to the VAT, V-A-T-T, the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope. And we meet with the Jesuits who are on duty there that day. I would tell you that these guys could give lessons to evangelicals in how to behave in a Christ-like manner. Just saying. They gave us everything we wanted. They were very cordial. They were very polite. And yes, they verified even what Malachi Martin had said. They were very familiar with that. They admitted. In fact, they told us that the only thing that, and we have them on film saying this, that the only thing that the Vatican is using their observatory on the top of Mount Graham for now is monitoring deep space objects which they believe could be hosts to advanced extraterrestrial intelligence. They said that's the only thing that they're using their telescope up there for now. We have them on film saying it. Anyway, they took us all through there, showed us where the astronomers sleep, the little humble kitchens that they use, took us up to the advanced telescope, let me and Chris climb all over the telescope up behind the back of it. There was one point where they unhooked some chains and we went up onto this platform and turned around and we could see skull and bones, and I thought, okay, these guys have got a plot. Let's get out of here. They're getting ready to electrocute us, right? So we got out of there. We went up to the next telescope, the radio telescope. Wasn't anybody there that day, but the guide unlocked the doors, let us in. We went in. We saw the big monitors that were monitoring parts of deep space. But since nobody was there to tell us anything, we left very quickly. And then, and you can go on YouTube, and you can see these pictures of me and Chris walking 2 city blocks up this steep hill all the way to the top to the large binocular telescope. Now, this is also used by the Vatican. This is the largest telescope of its kind in the world. And that place was buzzing. I mean, there were people in every room. They were in the lunch rooms. They were in the monitor rooms. There was a whole group of astronomers from Germany that were there making adjustments to this thing. If you go watch the trailer for the book Exa Vaticana, you'll see me and Chris, and I think we were on the 7th story. You go up this elevator, but then you walk out on just this wire railing, and we're way up above the top of the twin mirrors that were in their relaxed position. And the guide that they gave us, he was actually the lead engineer, spent the whole day with us. We were amazed by that too. But if you watch the trailer for Exa Vaticana, you'll see him with a laser pointer. We're 7 stories up looking down, and he's pointing at a devilish red object in the middle of the twin mirrors, and he says, "This is the Lucifer device." And that is, yes, exactly what it is called. It is an acronym, and it stands basically for, in fact, Chris was the only guy I ever knew that could say what the acronym actually stands for, but it implies that this is infrared technology. And what this technology does is it allows the twin mirrors to look further into space and therefore deeper back in time than what regular telescopic technology can do. And if you go to YouTube and type in infrared UFO, you will see some of the most astonishing deep space objects that can't be explained. And the weird part about it is, it's as the infrared telescope is looking at exactly the same place in space that non-infrared telescopes are looking at. And in one, you can't see anything at all, but in the infrared, it is alive with activity. And in fact, another thing we have on film, and in November, we're revisiting all of this stuff big time, and we are going to be giving away a ton of stuff at Skywatch Television in November, including 40 hours of secret interviews that we've been conducting with aerospace engineers, some of the priests from the Vatican, tons of stuff. And we'll edit out the coughing. We're going to be giving all that stuff away, but it includes some of the stuff that we brought down from Mount Graham. Now, what was I talking about? Where was I? I don't want to talk about all the stuff we're going to give away. I had something else. Infrared technology. So we go inside the main control rooms, the last place we went that day. And Joe Artis could tell you this is true, and I'm not sure what all of this he got on film. But we were shocked when they were so openly admitting to the presence of deep space UFOs, and they meant what appear to be intelligently driven, whatever the term is, controlled artifacts. We were just, because we didn't ask him that question. We're just sitting there, he's telling us a story about, okay, if somebody wants to use the large binocular telescope, they got to make an application to use the telescope, and then he starts telling us a story of, for instance, we had this guy recently that wrote a paper, it was peer-reviewed. He wanted to use the LBT to make sure, some of his observations were correct, so he goes through the whole process, goes through ASU, comes up there, and he's telling us, he says, so we point the LBT at the part of space that he wants to look at, and he said, we literally had to sit there for 2 hours and wait for the UFOs to get out of the way so that he could study this part of deep space. And I'm sitting there, and Chris and me and Joe were like, what? Really? You guys just talk about this like it's nothing? So we were blown away by that. Okay, very quickly, 16 minutes. Now we come down off the mountain, right? Man, we think we have slain the fatted calf. Boy, now when we go on radio, people are going to pay attention. They're not just going to think it's a couple of radical evangelicals taking cheap shots at the Vatican's astronomers, because we got them on tape, we got everything, this is going to be great. So we send the book, Exo Vaticana, off to the printer, and we go on the radio, but I made an assumption. Did you ever do that? All right? Only to find out later, nope, you're wrong, right? My assumption was this. Now we're on the radio. We're talking to all this media again. We're on TV. And I had done this like 3 times in a row before somebody corrected me, where I said that the reason why the Apache Nation had originally joined environmentalists in Arizona, literally filed a federal lawsuit, took it all the way to federal court to try to stop Arizona State University, NASA, and the Vatican from building this observatory on the top of Mount Graham. I had said the reason that the Apache did that, I think, is because they were there ahead of everybody else, right? So their forefathers and foremothers had lived and died on the mountain. Some of them, perhaps their bones are still up there. So they did not want, a bunch of heavy earth-moving equipment up there disturbing the mountains, potentially disturbing the bones of their ancients. So this is something like holy ground. This is like a cemetery for them, right? That's what I said. So about the 3rd time I say that, I get an email from one of the elders of the Apache Nation who hears us, right, on one of these programs. And he emails me and he says, Tom, he said, what you said is okay. It's true enough. That's probably also true, and that was, part of our sentiments, but that is not why we joined this lawsuit. He said, the reason that we joined the lawsuit is Mount Graham is one of the 4 holiest mountains in all of the world for all indigenous Americans. And it is, he said, because, Tom, it is what you would call a stargate, a doorway, a portal, a strategic geographic location at which and through which entities have entered into and exited our 3-dimensional reality since the dawn of time. Well, when he told me that, I went out and vetted it to make sure it was true, and that is true. And then my head really did go into the conspiracy meter Richter scales, as now I was trying to figure out now why would the Vatican of all mountains, because this was always a question to us, why go all the way to federal court, right? Why not just move on down the road, find another mountain that'll give you the same basic elevation and environmental conditions? A lot of little towns across America would love to have your business there. Why fight this? Even the governor of Arizona had to do an in-run around environmental concerns and laws and basically grant by fiat that they were going to be allowed to go up there to build that observatory. Why that mountain? But the minute that he said that, then the light went on. Because we have found this in location after location. In fact, when Timothy Alberino does speak, if he hasn't already, he might bring up the last two Gen 6 documentary films in which all over the world, whether it's Peru or Mount Graham, you find that anywhere there is a long history of esoteric activity or the bones of the giants or whatever, you'll find the Catholic Church moving in and setting up a controlling presence there, just like they did on the top of Mount Graham. So now I'm like, wow. Why of all mountains does the Vatican want to be in a place where all indigenous tribes believe that this is a doorway into another dimension? And since that time, because we met some of the Indians that live at Mount Graham, we have received film. I'm telling you, some of the stuff that we're going to be releasing, you can hardly believe. What look like sprites, ghosts, whatever you want to call them, moving in and out of the mountain. One of them absolutely terrifying. I mean, it looks like the meanest alien gray you've ever seen, right? The weirdest stuff that people are catching on camera involving that mountain. So, anyway, I got to go really quickly here. The other thing, 11 minutes. The other thing that got to me was then we learned about the oldest Apache creation story involving Mount Graham and the surrounding area. And I thought this too is probably connected with the Vatican because they tell this story. And several of the Navajo, several of them have similar renditions of this story. But it's the oldest one, and it says, in the time before time, a large silvery disk descended down over the top of the mountain. And in it, some say on it, sat a bearded man, which is interesting because the Apache don't have facial hair. And when they describe him, they're describing this, whatever it is, in terms that seem more similar to the Old Testament and Book of Revelation's descriptions of God as a creator, as the Ancient of Days, right? And for those that might be watching us around the world via live streaming tonight, and for those that are sitting in this auditorium that may have leanings towards the ancient astronaut theory and ancient aliens and that sort of thing, who might look at this story and go, aha, see? Giant disk, came from Zeta Reticuli. What's the guy with the big hair? It's alien. I'm not saying it's aliens, but it's aliens, right? And they tinkered with early hominid DNA and created advanced Homo sapiens sapien, the Anunnaki, right? But actually, when you listen to the Apache, it sounds like they are very much describing what the ancient Hebrew scribes called the Merkavah and the Merkavim. And this is also in the Bible. It is the wheel in the middle of the wheel. It is, the King James says God moves about on a cloud. It is 2 Chronicles, the chariot of the cherubim. It is what Josh Peck, we're also going to be giving his book away. Wow, we're giving away a lot of stuff. How can I do that? I might want to recalculate something. But he's putting out a book called Unraveling the Multiverse. It's his biggest book yet. And there's a whole section in there on this angel class that are mentioned in the Bible, but all throughout ancient Hebrew texts, called the Ophanim. And you hardly, or maybe never, read about them in other books on angels. But the Ophanim are described in ancient texts as brilliant, cylindrical, and that move back and forth from the throne of God. So this is what Gary Stearman would call the angelic transportation device, right? This is what Ezekiel saw. Well, anyway, that's what they describe. This, whatever it is, that carries about the throne of God. It comes down over the top of Mount Graham. And then the great creator God begins creating all of the good things that are upon the earth. But then, shortly thereafter, somebody else comes through the portal. And this man isn't really a man. They say he is a dragon, a reptile. And in fact, you can find him drawn in the petroglyph through the Four Corners areas. If you go to Utah and go to Newspaper Rock, you'll see the spiral vortex and the giant reptilian entity with the halo around his head that they drew on their stones in the Four Corners area at the same time in history that Moses was writing the Old Testament. That's how old some of these paintings are. But they say he was a deceiver. I was told by an academician from the Navajo Nation, Dr. Don Mose. He told me this story, and he said this entity began teaching the natives how to go down into their underground kivas. And instead of using them for prayers and that sort of thing, to practice what he called witchcraft, sorcery, pharmakia, cannibalism. In fact, we uncovered evidence in the book, the cover of which was up there a minute ago, Uncovering the Lost World of the Cloud Eaters. We found evidence of finger bones and human remains inside some of these kivas, where they were literally practicing sorcery to put themselves into contact with other dimensions. And then, according to both the Apache, the Navajo, and others, all of a sudden, the gates of the earth opened up. And up out of the earth come these gigantic, terrible, what we would call Nephilim. In fact, the Apache tell the story of Arizona, the Maricopa County part of Arizona, where Phoenix and Mesa and Tempe and all of that is, of the Indians that were living there then who were called the Tartums, peaceful farming Indians. And all of a sudden, these giants start sweeping across the Arizona Badlands. They call them the Jindupid. They're so big, they're using tree limbs and whole trees for toothpicks, and they are raping and pillaging and wiping out and cannibalizing. And some of the women that are raped are giving birth to six-fingered, six-toed, lion-like teeth mutations. Did it really happen? Yes. In fact, the University of Colorado in recent years did what they call the San Canyon Pueblo dig. You can go to their website and read it for yourself, where they found unusually large what happened to the anasazi? Unusually large anasazi with six fingers, six toes, lion-like teeth, distorted mandibles. So yeah, there was something very crazy that was going on here. Now, the other thing, 6 minutes. Okay, I'm doing this and I quit. The other thing is Chris and I needed to know. We did not want to be accused of propagating New Age ideas. And it was important to he and I to preserve biblical integrity in our research. And so this idea that there could be strategic locations, often associated with mountainous regions, that are doorways through which both good and evil can enter into this reality. At least that's the theory. We wanted to know if there was anything in the Bible that would support that. And once we started reading the Bible and just letting it speak for itself, we were astonished at how much is in Scripture that supports this narrative. Jesus in the New Testament saying to his disciples, "From henceforth you will see the windows of heaven open, and angels ascending and descending upon the Son of Man." When you go to the Old Testament, and if Moses is going to meet with God, he has to go to the top of Mount Sinai. In Zechariah 14, which many of the prophecy experts at this conference would tell you is a prophecy of the second coming of Jesus Christ, but when it describes his return, what does it say? His feet will first touch the top of the Mount of Olives, and from there he will descend down into the valley. If you go into the apocryphal book of Enoch, which is still in some Orthodox versions of the Bible and is quoted by some of the New Testament writers, but be that what it is, it's not in our canon today, or not in most of our canon. But if you read the apocryphal book of Enoch, it says that in the days of Jared, what happens? The watchers come down onto the top of Mount Hermon, and it is from there that they descend down into the valley and begin their illegal activity. Years later, Jesus is with his disciples right there in Caesarea Philippi at the base of Mount Hermon, right? And at the time of Christ, by the way, not just the Greeks, the Hebrews, the disciples of Jesus believed that the gate to hell was Mount Hermon. And that is the reason why Jesus is standing there with his disciples when he says, "The gates of hell will not prevail against my church," right? And then he begins telling them another story. Then he tells them, he reminds them of the story of Jonah. And he says, as Jonah was in the belly of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights, so shall also be the Son of Man. Read the story of Jonah and find something of interest that you probably didn't learn in Sunday school. Not only was he swallowed by a giant fish, a grouper or whatever, and spat out at the bottom of the ocean, but as above, so below. Not only are there windows in heaven, not only are there gates on the earth, but when he is spit out at the bottom of the ocean, according to the book of Jonah, he arrives there at a place called Baravak, which means the city of the great gate or the city of gates. And he goes through one of the gates, and we know where it takes him because he later says that God delivered him out of the belly of Sheol Hades. But back to Jesus. He's standing at Mount Hermon, telling them the gates of hell will not prevail. And then what does he do? Jesus literally goes up onto the top of Mount Hermon and stands on the top of the gates of hell. And that is where he is transfigured before his disciples. Not long after, by the way, he'll send 72 disciples to preach the gospel. Why? Because 72 was the number, according to antiquity, of the fallen angels that had built this entire contraption that was to the gates of hell. Essentially what he was doing is saying, I'm here, boys, and there is nothing that you can do to stop what we are going to do now. We're here and we're taking it back. Wherever my feet touch earth is holy ground, right? And he immediately goes from there, when what happens? He goes to Jerusalem and he is crucified. And the New Testament says, if the lords of this world would have known what was going to happen next, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory, right? Because he goes down into Sheol Hades. And by the way, he presents himself there, the Bible says, according to the spirits that are in prison. Those are the locked up watchers that started all of this stuff. He goes down and again he says, here I am. You tried to stop me. It didn't work. And now we learn that not only are there gates of the earth, there are also keys to the gates, because Jesus rises from the dead, and what happens? He comes forth with the keys to death, hell, and the grave, right? Giving gifts unto men, taking captivity captive. I have 1 minute, so I can't start preaching. All right. It goes on and on. Genesis chapter 28, Jacob's ladder. Everybody says that Jacob wakes up and says, this is the house of God. Read that even in the King James is not what he says. He says there is a gate here that opens to the house of God. Genesis 10, and Cush begat Nimrod, and Nimrod began to be a Gibborim. Now imagine that. And everything there, by the way, in the Hebrew, says that something corruptible began happening in his DNA, in his makeup. How the Old Testament says, in all flesh was corrupted, both man and beast. Something began happening, like a retrovirus moving through him. He began becoming an offspring of the Watchers. And this character, by the way, is legendary in all of the ancient Middle East. He is considered the king of the giants. In fact, the Sumerians call him Gilgamesh, the half-man, half-god, king of the giants. Josephus says that when he went, very next chapter, by the way, chapter 11, he goes to the plains of Shinar. Why? To build a tower. What is the tower supposed to do? At the top of it, there is a gate. In fact, the Sumerians call it Edamananki, which means the gate to God. So I ran out of time. The bottom line is, even that thing's flashing. Time is up. Shut up, shut up, shut up. Somebody else has to speak. Thank you, folks, for putting up with me. Sorry I didn't get to the end. God bless you.